he had some sort of crisis. Like, what's the point of my life? What am I going to do? What am I going to strive for? And he did decide it would be about abolitionism and slavery. And he went to talk to someone he knew, a friend, someone called John Newton. Now, this John Newton's a fascinating character to me.
Right.
He later became a clergyman, a priest, the Reverend John Newton.
Right.
That was a bit later in his life. But he had a very, very action-packed early life, like a weirdly... Some people are not black and white. They've got a checkered past, and they've got a very complicated emotional life, a complicated emotional backstory.
Yeah.
And he's one of those. So when he was a young man, John Newton was taking a ship to the Americas, and he was just pressed into the Royal Navy against his will.
Well, this happened a lot.
Right. And then he was flogged at one point for insubordination. You know, like quite bad injustices.
Yeah.
And then at one point he fell out with another captain on a ship. So they abandoned him in West Africa.
Thank you. Well, at least I didn't want to be in the Navy.
And then he was enslaved.
Oh, God.
By black slavers in West Africa. He was enslaved. He became the personal slave of some black princess in West Africa.
Right, okay.
He became her slave.
Yeah.
Eventually he escaped and got out. But he'd known what it was like to be first impressed type of indentured slavery, and then an actual slave. Then he went on to control a slave ship himself.
Okay.
And apparently he was like, when he did that, he was as humane as he could be, because he sort of knew. So he'd been a slave and a slaver earlier in his life.
It's a very interesting set of circumstances.
And then became sort of, well, already, but then became sort of an arch abolitionist.
Right.
He was sort of a famous abolitionist, but later in life became a priest and everything. But yeah, what a complicated thing that is, right?
Yeah.
And so for Wilberforce, he was like, he's the guy I've got to go to and speak to about my crisis.
He knows about,
you know. I mean, this John Newton wrote Amazing Grace, the song Amazing Grace.
Right, okay.
He talks about how God saved a wretch like me.
Yeah.
Deep stuff, really, to be fair.
Yeah.
And John Newton said to Wilberforce, oh my God, you're a member of Parliament, you're friends with Pitt. Don't give that up. Because Wilberforce was saying, I think I want to become a priest or something, become a clergyman of some type. And John Newton said, you're in a potentially an incredibly powerful position. You know, being a member of Parliament in the late 18th century, you're among the most powerful men in the world.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, among the most powerful cabals there's ever been, in a sense. Especially if you're friends, you've got the ear of Pitt. Use that. Don't throw that away. Use that. And so, well, he did. John Newton wrote a book called An Authentic Narrative, all about this sort of thing.
Right, okay.
Again, very powerful.
Yeah.
Pitt himself, when Wilberforce went to him, had some conversation with him about what to do, and he'd already been deeply involved in the abolitionist movement. It's recorded that Pitt said there was a meeting with Wilberforce, Pitt, and William Grenville, the Lord Grenville, who goes on to be Prime Minister himself afterwards. In fact, he's the Prime Minister when the Abolitionism Act is passed. He's the Prime Minister. These three guys are sitting around having a conversation on one of Pitt's estates, I believe, underneath a particular oak tree that has been called the Wilberforce Oak. And Pitt is supposed to have said to Wilberforce, why don't you give notice of a motion on the subject of the slave trade, a motion in Parliament?
Yeah.
You've already taken great pains to collect evidence and are therefore fully entitled to the credit which doing so will ensure you. Do not lose time or the ground will be occupied by another. So again, Pitt, sort of an arch pragmatist, a political realist, if nothing else. And he was many other things, but, it was like, it's all about the votes. It's all about the numbers. It's all about what you can and can't do in Parliament.
Yeah.
Do it. And so, Wilberforce did it. It became his life's calling, really. He said, my walk is a public one, his walk of life. My walk is a public one. My business is in the world, and I must mix in the assemblies of men or quit the post which Providence seems to have assigned me. So he realised, he took the advice of Pitt and John Newton. Okay. And he had a fortune as well, some sort of reasonable fortune, William Wilberforce. Ended up spending it all by the end of his life on philanthropic ventures. So yeah, that's what he. And another quote from him: he said, "God Almighty has placed before me two great objects: the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners, i.e., morals." Because he realised that he had to change really the whole nation's view of it. Most people thought, yeah, it's bad, but what can you do? It's the way it is.
Yeah.
Like maybe arms trading, or that there's nukes in the world.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, what can I do though? Yeah, it's really bad. If I could switch a switch, I'd say there would be no nukes or there'd be no arms trades or whatever. But what can I do? It's just the way of the world. He wanted to change that. So whilst he did his work in Parliament, he also spent endless time and energy just trying to change the minds of normal people, of everyone, but also especially of sort of the landed Howard class.
Yeah,
as well.
it sounds to me that there was already a large number of people who are in favour of this. There's already, of the regular working people of Britain, slavery wasn't a popular concept.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Like I say, the groundswell. You have these petition drives where thousands of people, workaday people, would sign up and say, "Yeah, it's a terrible injustice."
Yeah, like I was saying earlier, like I was looking at the Parliament website, and they've got pictures of one that's something like 3 miles long with 30,000 signatures, and it was delivered by the Women of England to Parliament. It's just regular people. It's because we've always found slavery abominable. Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. And yeah, like of course, William Wilberforce didn't begin the abolitionist movement. Yeah, right. It'd already been around for a long time. Since the beginning, since the days of Drake and the Portuguese first shipping Africans across the Atlantic, the so-called Middle Passage. Immediately, some people were like, well, this is a terrible thing.
Yeah.
Why are we involved in it? So Wilberforce had a lot of support in Parliament. All the great parliamentarians, Fox, Burke, Pitt, they were all on his side. They all agreed with him. But it's about the numbers, right? If you haven't got the numbers to win a vote, that's it. That's the bottom line. But he also had a great circle of friends of sort of famous abolitionists. They were called the Clapham Circle, or the Clapham Sect, or the Clapham Saints. Sometimes they're called. All sort of worshipped in a particular church, the Holy Trinity Church in Clapham. And the clergyman that led that was a guy called John Venn, sort of famous rabble-rousing type abolitionist. There's quite a lot of famous ones. James Stephen was a lawyer. Henry Thornton, an MP, who's sort of a well-regarded economist, well-regarded member of Parliament. Hannah More, sort of in her time, quite a famous playwright and poet, sort of lent her pen to the cause. Thomas Clarkson, again, relatively famous guy. But like I say, there was a groundswell. It was a big movement, but they were up against, they were up against moneyed interests, powerful interests, because then, as now, worse then actually, lots of members of Parliament were bought and paid for.
Yeah.
Right.
And a lot of the slave trade was done by landed interests, like the aristocracy. I recall reading a thing about how the most prolific slave trader was some Scottish lord who literally had something like 50,000 slaves or something. It was crazy how big his estates were, and it was just like, right, okay. And so you've got the aristocratic, a large portion of the aristocratic class who's just totally in favor of it, and then so much money that roots the thing in place. So even if there is an actual connection between the sort of parliamentary elite and the general populace, it might not be enough to do it.
Exactly. By this time, it was really sugar interests, sort of one of the biggest one.
Yep.
Before we lost the Americas, there'd be a lot more cotton, tobacco interests. But by the late 18th century, it was really sugar in the West Indies, the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Sugar interests, really. And lots of MPs were bought and paid for by sugar interests. And so no amount of convincing or moralising would get them to vote against their overlords
being made by the sugar trade.
Yeah. So massive was the sugar trade. There's a great little example or story anecdote. At one point, much earlier in the 18th century, there might have been some sort of deal where Britain wanted to swap all of our holdings in Canada, basically all of Canada, for one French island in the West Indies. I can't remember which one, but one small little sugar island.
Yeah.
And France said, no, that's not a good deal. That's not in our interest. That's how much money flowed through the West Indies and sugar. Yeah. So yeah, to put it in some perspective, it's almost unbelievable but that is true. Quakers despised slavery, and evangelicals, all evangelicals and Quakers, lots of Christians. You've got to give it to them.
Yeah,
I wouldn't dream for a second of, trying to skate over that. It comes from Christianity that we're all God's creatures. Yeah. It's a bit kumbaya, but it's good though, right? It's not wrong.
Yeah,
it's not wrong, right? Yeah. In fact, there's William Wilberforce had a plaque made up by Josiah Wedgwood, one of the royal artists, where on it there was sort of an early byline or an early slogan for the abolitionists. There's like a picture of a slave in chains, and it says, "Am I not a man and a brother?"
Yeah.
Yeah, right. We'll obviously put an image of that up. One of the things that Wilberforce was known for was being very quick-witted and sort of sarcastic and difficult to best in a one-on-one exchange. Very witty, quite funny sometimes, and just a great networker, what we would call a networker. They didn't use that word. But he would make friends and this idea of networking amongst landed interest, powerful people. Quite a lot of men that were in the Commons were also lords.
Yeah.
That used to be a thing.
Yeah.
You could be, sorry, not in the Commons and Lords, but you could be a member of government in the Lords.
Yeah.
So over 30 years, really, or more, he would just try and impress upon the right people that it's just the correct moral thing to do to abolish slavery. Because what nearly all abolitionists really wanted was a complete destruction of slavery. But there are two different things going on there. There's the slave trade, and then there's slavery itself.
Yeah.
So when we talk about abolitionism, we're talking about abolishing the slave trade. And then there's true emancipation, where you make all slaves free.
Yeah.
Two different things.
And the reason that you have to do one first is simply the scope of the problem.
Right, exactly.
There's too much money involved. It's too difficult to be able to get the leverage. But if you say, well, look, you can't buy and sell slaves, but you can still have the ones you've got, that's a kind of softer blow on the road.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.